interpret the handwriting and say it in the tone that you wrote it in. So I'll try to do that, but I'm not very good at it. I haven't completed my acting lessons. So the first question is, we've known about the role of climate change for 20 years, at least. Why don't the flood insurance maps include sea level rise due to climate change? John?
Yeah, I guess let me try that one. The National Flood Insurance Program, again, is a flood insurance program, and I guess I think of it as today's risk. It's a product that says, you know, what are the conditions right now, and not where are we going to be in years ahead. But as that product, as that mapping became used for more than flood insurance, we ran into an issue. The housing stock is lasting over 150 years. These flood insurance rate maps are old by the time they're released. In the case of Sandy mapping, so we've had the entire coast, the entire tidal area of New Jersey going up into the boroughs have been restudied. That mapping, which is coming out in a preliminary form, will be the landform that existed before Sandy. Let me say that again. The mapping that's coming out real soon in a preliminary form, so this is what municipalities are going to look to commenting on before adopting, will be the landform that existed before Sandy. We know that's not the case. So anytime we have these products, they're not going to be for the future. They're going to be a static condition. That's why we need to look at it. But when you're doing land use planning, when you're doing planning into the future, we do need to start looking at sea level rise. We need to use other products or integrate products in looking at future risk. And I think that's where we heard today about one tool, and we're going to hear this afternoon, I believe, about some other tools that need to be used. It can't just be the National Flood Insurance Program.
Maybe I can add on to the question a little bit. Megan, you said that your company produces flood risk mapping for places that don't have it, like in Canada. Do you include climate change impacts?
Right now, those maps are, from my understanding, a snapshot of the current flood risk. But something to remember is that insurance contracts are typically written from year to year. And it's different where you're planning financially from year to year than if you're planning financially for 30 years down the line with your land use management and allocating costs to that and how you want to develop it. So, I mean, I think that we need to consider what are the purpose of these maps. They're meant for an annual insurance contract renewal. They're not meant for land use planning.
So we had a question coming on Twitter that said, if New Jersey is number 3 in the country for the National Flood Insurance Program, do you think we need to pay attention to building resiliency? John, that might be for you again, but anybody else who wants to jump in, please do.
Yeah, what that stat means to me is we have a flood problem. I guess I talked about David Conrad and his years of service on Capitol Hill trying to bring up these issues. But he came to our flood conference a couple weeks ago and said, you know, he's like, you deal with the Louisiana delegation, and rightly or wrongly, they do some things that are probably good and some things that are not. But they're very active in flood issues and water issues. That delegation is really, you know, we'll be coming out with you know, legislation, the WRDA bill, the Water Resource Development Act, things like that. The New Jersey still is not getting that we're a flood-prone state, that we have a problem. And I think that's where a statistic like we're number 3 starts to have to wake us up and say, look, this is a problem. We have to first admit, and I tweeted the other day, hey, you know, the first step, I guess, in the 12th step is admitting we have a problem. Look, we have a problem. And there's nothing more, you know, we don't need more data. We have 11 disaster declarations in 8 years. We're number 3 in the NFIP paid claims. You know, we don't need more wake-up calls. We have a problem.
To jump back to the first question, I made very quickly. This illustrates the challenge. That is, there's a problem in the present, and the state of the people are having a hard time address that problem in the present before you factor in the climate issue. We are, of course, very glad to provide maps of risk that do take into account the climate issue and sea level rise in our tools.
And if I can stay with you, there was a question, again, by email in this case. The data from New York and the climate change panel is expressed in a range. Where in the range does the cliff effect become apparent? And anybody else might want to jump in on that as well, or perhaps you can start.
Yeah, that's a great question. What I showed was really a projection right down the middle of their range. If you go to the high end of their range, the 75th percentile, the cliff is much worse. And if you go to the 25th percentile, toward the low end of their range, there's still a cliff in some places and not in others. It gets a little delayed. But it's a very, very basic fact of how sea level rise and extreme flooding interact. That a small change in sea level can magnify the risk of extreme floods a lot. And maybe one way to briefly get that point across is think of actually dunking in basketball. It's hard to dunk. Not every, a dunk happens every once in a while, okay? But it's a pretty rare event. A shorter player might not be able to dunk. Now, what happens if you raise the basketball floor by a few inches? You see a lot more dunks. And if you raise it by a few inches more, you see only dunks. So it's just a few inches of change can lead to a very large consequence. And that is sea level rise and coastal flood risk and flood.
So as I noted before, sometimes scientists disagree. You would have to raise it by several feet before I could do it. So let me see. There's a question here that I want to get it right, but it's a little hard to read. Do people think that just restricting any development on the coast is a viable option? But I would probably reword that to say, how do you restrict development on the coast? And again, I would ask anyone to jump in on that, if you want to. This is more of a policy question, and we're assessing risk in. So I would say that there's no question that you have to restrict some development. I think really what the question is getting at is, what's the limit? And that comes back to how much risk are you willing to take? And we might couple it with another question that came in that says, is the idea of the government getting out of the flood insurance business a viable option? That was directed to you, Megan, but I think others might want to jump in on it. And would the private insurance industry step in to provide flood insurance?
Well, I mean, with regards to the first question on the policy side, coming at it from a personal level, I grew up on the Jersey Shore. My parents have a summer home at Ocean Beach for 30 years. My grandparents had one for 50 years. So, I mean, I think that it's a place that evokes a lot of emotion. There are people that have very deep ties there. And I don't think that you can say, we just can't redevelop it. I think that from a social standpoint and an economic standpoint, it's just way too important. But I think we really have to look at how are we going to rebuild, and where are we going to put systems in place? And I mean, where are we just going to let the land be taken back? And I think that that's something that, unfortunately, we very much have to consider. We're in a different situation than we were October 28th, 2012. With regards to the private market flood insurance, there was a mandate given by Congress to the NFIP to investigate the viability of private market insurance solutions in 2012 before Sandy. Now, typically, NFIP policies only cover residential risk and small commercial risk. Large commercial and large industrial risk, they buy their flood insurance from the private market. Typically, they might be able to get a first event cover with a lower deductible from the NFIP, but there already is an established private flood market. There is also an established private flood market in other countries for residential risk. So the insurance industry has demonstrated that yes, a private market for flood insurance is possible. It will be interesting to see what develops as this mandate with Congress moves forward. Now, the NFIP already put out an RFP for a private market flood assessment. So I think that, that's the first step. That's to be completed in 14 months, and then we'll go from there. I think there potentially is a private market flood insurance solution. We have a lot of expertise. We also have the benefit of having global diversification and the ability to give a global analysis of risk. So I think that there is a potential solution that could come from this mandate from Congress.
Let me just pick up on something that I think is always interesting. So Megan's Swiss Re is the reinsurance for other insurance companies. The reinsurance for the National Flood Insurance Program is all of you. All right, it's the federal taxpayer, so that's coming out of the U.S. Treasury. So when we do run over and the program can't pay back its borrowing with interest, where we had in Katrina and we had in Sandy, it's the U.S. taxpayer picking up the tab. All right, that's the reinsurance of the National Flood Insurance Program. So going back to the question, we've already built up the coast, especially New Jersey. You drive along the coast or you spend any time and you're like, it's pretty much, that's the density issue. So what do we do? No, we can't completely revert back to natural systems, our natural conditions, but we need to start adapting. There are certain areas that are too risky to build in or rebuild in. There was a bill in the legislature and the governor vetoed it to build out on piers, residential structures. Well, there's all kinds of issues with that, and I'm very happy the governor vetoed that bill. But there are other areas that are at incredibly high risk. I actually, and you can certainly, inform me, but I see the insurance companies becoming the new regulators into the future. It's going to be the insurance industry that's going to say, hey, we're not going there. That's too high a risk. We're not going to support rebuilding here. We're not going to. And they're giving us plenty of advance notice. I mean, the reinsurance companies have been doing a lot of education to us, saying, look, we're worried about this. We're worried about the future conditions. At some point, they're going to have to say, look, we just can't be here. It's too risky. I think that's going to play a role. If government's not going to do it in a gradual manner, I think the insurance companies are going to start regulating.
And I mean, there's actually already an example of that in Florida after 2004. There were many private insurers that either increased the premiums to reflect what they thought were the true risk or just stopped writing business in Florida.
So as a former regulator, I wish you a lot of luck with that. It's quite a lot of fun. There's a whole lot of questions around insurance. I'm going to come back to those in a minute. I just want to take some other ones to make sure that we have time to get them in. But I'd also note for the audience in general that we'll continue on the Union of Concerned Scientists website to try to address questions on our blog series, which you can find at blog.ucsusa.org. That will be around this topic, so if all questions don't get answered here, we'll continue to try to write on this topic afterwards. So the next question is, what tactics in stormwater mitigation can local governments take to reduce flooding risks within the next few years? Does that require the creation of government positions that work on stormwater issues to help alleviate the problems more quickly?
As much as I deal with flooding, I also deal with stormwater, so let me take a shot at that. Yes, the stormwater rules for New Jersey came out around 9 years ago. There are a lot of things in those rules, if you read them, are great. There are really good non-structural techniques. There's all kinds of things in there. It just hasn't been realized. The oversight of that program and the implementation of stormwater rules in New Jersey has been very disappointing. There are things we can do. We've repackaged low impact development, non-structural, into something we're calling now green infrastructure. It is now the buzzword in stormwater, and it's really coming to fruition through combined sewer overflows, combined sewer systems. Philadelphia is a great example, where they said, look, instead of putting things underground, we're going to do it on the surface. We're going to do it through green infrastructure. which actually has an aesthetic value. It has other values other than just volume control of stormwater. Stormwater plays a role in flooding. There are a lot of times we don't just get a hurricane or a nor'easter that affects the coast, but we get local flooding. We get localized flooding from rainfall, and that's where stormwater plays a big role, especially in our urban areas. That's where definitely stormwater plays a major role.
Thank you for that. Perhaps this adds on to that, but there were a couple of questions that came in about the status of the Blue Acres program for reclamation in floodplains in New Jersey. Is it utilized? Is it funded? Is it implemented? Is there a national policy that helps reclaim floodplains? Does anybody know the details on this program? I'm getting those. You do, John? Do you want to say something?
The Blue Acres program was basically born out of a task force for the Delaware River. The Delaware River had flooding in 04, 05, and 06. And one of the important things that came out of that was a subset of the Green Acres program called Blue Acres. So this would be for flood-prone lands and, again, voluntary, really important voluntary acquisitions. It's been incredibly successful. It's something, again, that the Passaic Flood Commission, I was on that as well, basically said, you know, this is important. This big Passaic tunnel, which I'm sorry, Governor Whitman's not here to hear this, but the Passaic Tunnel was a huge boondoggle. It's a crazy idea. I spent a lot of time looking over the Corps of Engineers plans, and I'm telling you, it is unbelievable. It would have more rock and soil removal than the channel between France and England, and it's unbelievable. It's wild. It's a wild idea, and I know Governor Whitman was opposed to it as a candidate for governor and also when she was governor. But what we did as a commission is say, we need to take steps. We need to start looking at voluntary buyouts. We need to look at elevations in some areas. We need to take these measured steps to start reducing our risk. So those are the important issues. It's getting, having a program that can be funded is really important, and having that local match. Remember that there's a lot of FEMA programs. We're getting about $250 million from FEMA for mitigation. Most of those programs are 75% federal, 25% local or non-federal. Something like a Blue Acres, Green Acres program is a vital local match to that federal money. That's how we really take advantage of our money, is basically multiplying it using the federal dollar. So not having that program funded going into next year is going to be an issue. It certainly will, and it's going to slow down voluntary acquisitions, which is what we really, really need.
If I can change gears a little bit, and then we'll come back again to some of the insurance questions. Tony, a question came in on email. You used the term, a zero emissions world, and the question was, what does that look like? I think I would refine it a little bit to say, what do you actually mean on taking a zero emissions path, and how does that affect those scenarios that you were presenting?
In a sense, it's actually pretty simple. In order to actually stabilize concentrations of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, you have to reach a point at which any net releases to the atmosphere are simply balanced by sinks. And it's actually, I think, underappreciated in the climate change policy discussions. This is not like air pollution, where we're going to cut a little bit of emissions and we'll see an immediate response in the atmosphere. You have to go to zero. You have to do it if you're going to keep global warming under about 2 degrees centigrade, which is a popularly discussed target. You have to actually have the peak sometime in the next 20 to 30 years. And it pretty much has to be zero or below by the end of the century.
I think maybe you want to define or describe what you mean by sinks in that case, so it doesn't mean you're...
Any process that removes greenhouse gases from the atmosphere, and whether it's growing forests, whether it's trapping carbon underground by engineering means, whether it's chemical destruction of gases in the atmosphere, anything that removes greenhouse gases from the atmosphere. So these are very, very challenging goals.
The basic point here is that if you put, fine particulates, air pollution into the air, they'll be washed out by the rain within a few weeks. We keep on putting them up, they keep on getting washed out, we have an ongoing problem. But carbon dioxide, a large fraction of that hangs around for centuries, and its warming effects as well. So, not on the fast end of the spectrum, but on the slow end of the spectrum. If you do an analysis, if I were to put a big bag of ice on this table right now, okay, it would be really hard for me to predict how fast it's going to melt exactly. And that's what we do when we try and project sea level rise for the century.
I say not very fast in this room.
We're doing our share. But for me to say, well, minute by minute, so many ounces, predict that, that's what the scientific community is basically trying to do when we project sea level rise this century. But, okay, it's trivial, except maybe in this room, to say it's all going to melt, right? That's obvious. We don't know exactly how fast. So you can do the same analysis, and it's easier with the global ice sheets. It might take hundreds of years, I don't know how long, but for every bit of carbon we put in the atmosphere that stays there for centuries, we're basically throwing more and more ice bags into warm rooms. And so in the long-term picture, we're already committed to 4 feet more of sea level rise. Committed, locked in the future. Okay, and that's enough to put more than 300 American towns and cities, many of them in New Jersey, mostly below high tide. If we continue business as usual by the end of the century, that commitment grows to 1,400 American towns and cities, about 23 feet of sea level rise. If we move to the zero emissions world, to the negative emissions world, we can arrest that at about 500 towns and cities that are locked in some point in the future to being below the high tide. So there's a real difference in your position.
So we have time for, I think, 2 more questions. I want to go back to the insurance issue, which...
Andy, can I
Go ahead.
let me jump in on something? Because one of the things that we've talked about a little bit, and a couple of the graphs that Ben showed again at this point, is, I think, an underappreciation for how people actually think about risk. And so one way to think about this is that if you're talking about an event like a flood that has a 1 in 100 chance of happening, so sort of the pure definition of a 100-year flood has a chance of about 1 in 100 of happening each year.